Nearly 50 African leaders, including other policymakers, heads of big institutions and businessmen, were in Washington, D.C. in December for the U.S.-Africa Leaders and Business Summit. Hosted by U.S. President Joe Biden, Africa returned home with $15 billion check from America in terms of deals and pledges.
Africa's economic transition depends on good government, healthy populations, and reliable and affordable energy. These things business seeks out when they're looking to invest. They attract new opportunities and they launch new partnerships. And the United States is committed to supporting every aspect of Africa's inclusive growth. Today, I'm announcing that the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation is investing nearly $370 million in new projects, $100 million to increase the reliable, clean energy for millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm announcing a new initiative, the Digital Transformation with Africa, working with Congress to invest $350 billion to facilitate more than almost $500 million in financing to make sure people across Africa can participate in the digital economy.
The Grand Washington, D.C. Summit may be considered a very good nightcap for Africa in 2022. Overall, however, the year had largely been difficult for the continent. By January 2022, many African countries were reopening their economies from the 2 years of brutal global COVID-19 pandemic. The continent had reported lower fatalities from the pandemic compared to the rest of the world. And according to the World Health Organization, COVID-19 deaths in the African region are expected to decline by almost 94% in year 2022. However, the impact of the virus pandemic was more brutal for Africa than the number of fatalities. This was how the African Development Bank puts it. But this seems to be just a curtain raiser in a cocktail of a perfect storm for sub-Saharan Africa in 2022. The Russian invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th was initially considered by some a regional conflict in Eastern Europe and far removed from sub-Saharan Africa. That was highly misplaced. The managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, described the Russian-Ukraine invasion as crisis on top of a crisis, which the African Economic Outlook report published in June by the EFDB says would add another 1.8 million people into extreme poverty in 2022, in addition to the existing 30 million poor people pushed into poverty in 2021 due to COVID-19 pandemic. But the Russian war presents a wider social and economic challenges.
The most immediate economic effect of the war has been a sharp spike in the prices of food, energy, fertilizer, and some important minerals, for which Ukraine and Russia are key suppliers to world markets. A potential food crisis is looming. Food and energy prices were already high by historical standards before the war. We need to stand back a bit and take a deep breath and try to remember, multilateralism and multilateral trade and the multilateral trading system, what it has been able to deliver. It's being challenged now. There's absolutely no doubt about that. There's a big challenge. This organization and multilateral institutions were created to integrate countries, to create interdependence, which would lead to peace. And it's clear that that's being challenged at this time. So we have to admit that. We have to look at the issue of the harvest in Ukraine and planting season, both for the impact on food this year but next year.
The good news here was that Africa was not completely abandoned to its many problems. The virus pandemic, climate disasters, and the attendant social and food security fallout of the Russian war in Ukraine. For a continent that imports 2/3 of wheat it consumes, there's an urgent need to combat the economic consequences associated with the war in Ukraine. Less than a month after the Russian invasion, the Africa Export-Import Bank announced a new $4 billion support program, a line of credit for African economies and companies. By the first week of April, requests for funding support by African countries has reached a historic high of $15 billion pending before Afreximbank headquarters in Egypt.
The ongoing Ukraine crisis presents new challenges to Africa. Difficulties in accessing grains, fertilizers, and petroleum products have led to galloping inflation in many of our countries, which we are just about to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Mindful that Africa's problems are for Africans to solve, Afreximbank has once again stepped in and put in place a $4 billion facility to enable African countries to respond to the Ukraine crisis. It is therefore evident that Afreximbank has become a vital instrument for crisis intervention. The successes of the interventions reminds us of the urgency not only to support our own institutions, but to make them stronger and more effective.
For good measure, the African Development Bank also threw in a lifeline of $1.5 billion under its African Emergency Food Production Facility Fund as part of the exercise to mitigate the impact of the Russian war on the continent.
I think that the issue here is to look at the broader contagion effects that this has actually had. Take, for example, the impact it has had on food production, food security globally. Now, look at the price, Ambassador, of wheat. The price of wheat has gone up by about 64% more globally. If you look at Africa, maybe average about 45% in terms of price of wheat. The price of maize has also gone up, of soybeans, of rice has gone up. And don't forget, not too long ago, we had the Arab Spring that came out of a food crisis, ignited in Tunisia. And so that is a problem. The second is that Africa depends a lot on Russia and Ukraine for supply of food. For example, out of the basically $4 billion that Russia exports to Africa, total value of export to Africa, 90% of that is actually for wheat. And if you take Ukraine, probably about of the $4.5 billion of exports to Africa, almost 55% of that, 54% of that is for wheat, and 31% of it is for maize. Now, the West Africa, not even West Africa, but it's Eastern Africa region, everything is maize. Everything is maize. Everything is ugali. Everything is even Southern Africa. Well, the point is, in Eastern Africa region, 90% of all their cereals come from these two countries. So you can imagine that is going to be a big impact. The second impact, which is going to be very serious, is fertilizers. The price of fertilizers have gone up by about 300%. And access to fertilizer becomes a constraining factor. In fact, today, Africa has a deficit because it imports a lot of those, about roughly almost 2 million tons. So we got to be able to deal with that.
International efforts were also forthcoming for the continent, largely coordinated in particular by the IMF, the World Bank, and China. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 and 2021 and the Russian war in Ukraine in 2022 seems to overshadow a much bigger problem that has been lurking around the continent for quite some time. Two major problems began to manifest across Africa as the new year 2022 gets underway. The first was inflation, a pass-through of mainly higher food and fuel prices. As of July, 29 out of 33 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa has inflation rates over 5%, and 17 countries had double-digit inflation.
We cannot possibly allow inflation to become a runaway train. Bad for growth and bad for people. Bad especially for poor people. I am convinced that if we do not restore price stability, we will undermine prospects for growth. We would create more uncertainty for investors, and we would put consumers in a very difficult spot.
There's a crisis facing development. We put out our poverty numbers last week, so showing 70 million more people in extreme poverty and faced with inflation and high energy prices. And the world needs to think in terms of cleaner fuels and transition fuels in order to help move the world forward.
But despite the acknowledgement of the global inflation crisis, especially in developing Africa, the problem did not abate. And the result was this in Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa.
Raising a baby alone isn't that easy, and then in this economy, it's very hard for the fees, feeding her, clothing. It isn't easy.
Things are too hard for me now. I don't even have money to go and buy the goods to come and sell again. All my money has been finished, so I don't have money. I'm really suffering.
Things are very hard. Before, if someone wants to buy like groundnut oil, they will buy the rubber home. But now, there's no money, and things are very expensive. Before, the sachet oil is cheaper than the other one. Now people prefer to buy the sachet because they don't have money to buy a large quantity.
We are calling those who are in power, both in government and in the private sector, to, as they make decisions, they must think of the majority of the working class. Commodity has gone up, so we are struggling as workers. So that's the reason why I'm here. The fuel price has gone up, the food price, I'm the breadwinner at home. So I'm now struggling to support my family back home in Limpopo.
The high rise of fuel, petrol, I have to pour something like 25 rand a liter, and I travel 40 to 50 kilometers to work on daily basis, which means I do 100 k's from home to work. So I cannot afford those kind of things.
The International Monetary Fund described decades-long inflation among Africa's most urgent challenges. The IMF suggested that tackling inflation using tight monetary policy requires vigilance not to hurt economic growth and protecting the vulnerable. So central banks from Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Kenya, Zambia, and others hit the interest rate button to the upside.
The committee's choices were on whether to further hike rates or pause for the impact of the last 3 rate hikes to continue to feed through. At this meeting, therefore, the options considered were primarily to hold or further tighten the policy rate. The options to loosen was not considered, as this would gravely undermine the gains of the last 3 policy rate hikes. Committee thus voted by a unanimous vote to raise the MPR. 9 members voted to raise the MPR by 100 basis points, and 2 members voted to raise the MPR by 50 basis points. In summary, MPC voted to 1. Raise the MPR to 16.5%, 2. Retain the asymmetric corridor of plus 100 and minus 700 basis points around the MPR, 3. Retain the CRR at 32.5%, and 4. Retain the liquidity ratio at 30%.
MPC decided to increase the repurchase rate by 75 basis points to 7% per year with effect from the 25th of November 2022. 3 members of the committee preferred the announced increase. 2 members preferred a 50 basis points increase. The level of the repurchase rate is now above the level prevailing before the start of the pandemic. The revised repurchase rate remains supportive of credit demand in the near term, while raising rates to levels more consistent with the current view of inflation and risks to it.
But beyond inflation and interest rates, there are other issues for the monetary authorities to deal with as well. The currencies of a number of African economies took a beating in the year under review. For example, the Ghanaian cedi was down 60%. The naira was down 4.5% officially against the US dollar, while the CFA franc suffered a 13.3% depreciation. Other worst currency performers in the year were Sudan, South Sudan, Malawi, and Sierra Leone. There is, however, the knotty problem of debt burden across nearly all the big frontier African economies: Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, Kenya, Zambia, and others. On this score, the optics are not looking good at all. The result of this scary debt scenario was a scrambling for solutions, which includes the $650 billion special drawing rights issued by the IMF, the existing G20 common framework for debt treatment, including those of the EFDB group. But the question is whether these mitigation assistance are coming too little and too late for Africa.
Today's announcement is a major policy step that the government is taking over the short period to restore macroeconomic stability, achieve debt sustainability, and get the economy fully back on track in order to create and protect jobs, provide and enhance incomes, foster strong and inclusive growth led by exports, and restore hope to the Ghanaian people. There will be no haircut on the principal of bonds. Individuals who hold bonds would also not be affected at all. Our domestic debt operation involves an exchange for new Ghana bonds with a coupon that steps up to 10% as soon as 2025, with zero interest in 2023 and the first interest payment in 2024, and longer average maturity for the bonds. This is a key requirement to allow Ghana's economy to recover as fast as possible from this crisis. This is also a key requirement to secure an IMF support. We are all in this together, and we intend to get out of this together.
What we decided to do is not to wait for it to happen. We have to start looking at how do we better manage our liabilities. For example, our domestic liabilities, we've been able to shift our loans from short tenors to medium and longer term tenors. We have to do the same thing for our international borrowings as well, bilateral loans, and even some of the concessional loans, that the periods could be stretched, should be stretched to give us more fiscal room. While we are working to increase revenue, to improve on our revenue to debt service, we still need to be able to renegotiate and stretch out our repayment obligations.
But despite the overarching doom and gloom scenarios that Africa faced in 2022, there are some good news in the haystack.
We launched in collaboration with the AFCFTA Secretariat and AU Commission the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System to support payment for intra-African trade in African currencies. That system is now operating. We have provided $3 billion to enable us support the clearing and settlement under that system. We've also launched the African Collaborative Transit Guarantee Scheme to enable goods to move across African borders easily.
And specifically on intra-Africa trade.
We have achieved significant progress in rules of origin. We have now convergence on 88% of products. If you think about it, in Africa we trade close to 5,000 products. Before the AfCFTA came into being, we were trading the same products using different local content, different rules of origin, and that has been constraining investment. We now are in a position where in 88% of products that are traded in Africa, there's a single rule for trade and investment. So we've achieved that. As you know, we launched the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System in January this year with Afreximbank. We have also launched the AfCFTA tariff book, so you can get on our website and you will be able to see which products are being traded, under what preferential treatment, what are the rules of origin that are applicable.
There are also some good news in 2022 on infrastructure built by governments and supported by local and overseas development partners and other financial institutions.
In Kinshasa, everywhere you will see people working, building infrastructure. We need it. We cannot speak about development without infrastructure, and especially about transport. That's why Metrokin is there. So we thank God that we have today President Tshisekedi that is under his vision that we are doing this project. So the country needs this. Kinshasa is about 15 million, more than 15 million people living in Kinshasa. So we need to organize a mass transport like train. So that is Metrokin, 4 phases. First going from the central station to the airport of Kinshasa. And the second phase is the plain of Kinshasa. And then we have Kinshasa in kind of a roundabout, a kind of a circle. And then we have from the airport to Maluku. Together we are going to build 300 kilometers of railway in Kinshasa.
I am happy to report that the African Exchange Link project that connects 7 of the biggest African stock exchanges, including this one in Nigeria, into a single trading platform was launched in 2022. That was a big step forward for the continent's financial markets and the economy. To conclude, this may be the biggest forward-looking news of the year 2022 for the African continent.
Africa belongs to the table in every room where global challenges are being discussed, and in every institution where discussions are taking place. That's why I announced in September at the United Nations General Assembly that the United States fully supports reforming the UN Security Council to include permanent representation for Africa. And today I'm also calling for the African Union to join the G20 as a permanent member of the G20.
I am Bosin Omofaye, and this is Africa. Down, but not out.